Great. Well, thanks, Rob. Before I start, let me just give a quick intro to this series. This is a joint event held with the American Enterprise Institute. And as many of you know, AEI has a long history of working on farm programs, dating back to the 1960s when D. Gale Johnson did a lot of work there. He was followed by Bruce Gardner, Dan Sumner, and now Vince Smith. For this particular farm bill, AEI has commissioned about 17 papers. You'll see 2 of them here being presented. We had some presented last week, rollout on risk management and on some of the overall price and income support programs. And we'll see some more over the next few weeks on areas like sugar and cotton and research and development and other things. I'm very, very happy to be part of that. My presentation is based on a paper that Dan Sumner and I co-authored that was just published today by AEI entitled U.S. Farm Policy and Trade. The Inconsistency Continues. The inconsistency alludes to 2 seminal books written by D. Gale Johnson. One, Trade and Agriculture, a study of inconsistent policies. That was published back in 1950. And World Agriculture in Disarray, which many people also know, published in 1973. Both of these studies identify how agricultural policies distort both domestic and international markets. I'd say over the last 44 years since World Agriculture in Disarray was written, a lot's changed. Trade, which has always been important for U.S. agriculture, but over the last 50 years, U.S. producers and consumers have become increasingly integrated into global markets. One only has to observe over the last few months how concerned U.S. producers are over renegotiations of NAFTA or trade disputes, potential trade disputes with China. And I would argue that one only has to go to the local supermarket to see how important trade is for U.S. consumers. In 1994, agriculture was brought into the rules of the World Trading System with the completion of the Uruguay Round and the creation of the World Trade Organization. Those agreements have provided improved market access for U.S. producers and have brought U.S. domestic policies under the disciplines of the Agreement on Agriculture, as well as WTO agreements on subsidies and other measures. Lastly, in part because of the efforts of Gale Johnson and others, U.S. agricultural policies have become more market-oriented. U.S. programs have evolved from command and control policies that dictated how much could be produced, how much could be marketed, to policies much more oriented towards risk management and income support, less tied to production. Yet despite such progress, distortions remain, and notably in high tariffs for a handful of commodities, price and income subsidies that still remain, and government-sponsored programs like crop insurance and dairy subsidy programs, which these are policies that all continue to transfer billions of dollars from taxpayers and consumers to farms and agribusinesses, distort crop prices in global markets, and expose the U.S. to challenges under WTO rules. Well, let's start the presentation looking at world trade. Global agricultural trade has nearly tripled since 2000. Developing countries' share of global imports and exports, and I think this is really an amazing story in and of itself. They've grown about a third. That is the share of total trade in these markets. And with that growth has come an increasing share of trade being south-south. So you think of things like soybeans being produced in Brazil and going to China, just a very big growth in these markets. And that's all pretty much occurred since the launch of the Doha Round in 2001. And I think has changed a lot of the overall thinking as that's evolved over time. U.S. agricultural trade has grown as well. And U.S. exports, these are deflated, or that is, they're adjusted for inflation, record highs in 2014, even after adjusting for inflation. And while they've fallen a bit over the last couple of years due to lower prices primarily, they remain high relative to historical levels. Imports, too, have hit record levels in recent years. The other big thing is China now is our top destination, is the U.S. top destination for U.S. ag exports. Canada is a close second, followed by Mexico. And those are 3 countries. I think it gives you, it's no wonder why U.S. ag groups are concerned with NAFTA renegotiations and trade tensions with China. These are huge markets that are accounting for a large share of overall U.S. exports. The EU and Japan, those were really the top markets of the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s. Those have, since 2000, have been fairly flat, and where the real growth has been in these other, the three countries that I mentioned. And if you look at overall U.S. exports, of course, they've fallen over the last 50 years, at least their exports as a share of world production. No question, following World War II into the 50s and 60s, U.S. was dominant in a lot of these markets, and that really began to change, particularly over the last 20 years. One is we've seen a stiff global competition in general, but in particular in areas like South America, which now are leading producers of soybeans, corn, livestock products, and poultry. And with the collapse of the former Soviet Union, we've now seen that area return to have been very, very large producers and dominant producers, where most of the growth is anticipated to come in things like wheat production and other grain production. Insofar as, I got ahead of myself, but it just shows here the what's going on in soybeans and the forecasts, and also with the former Soviet Union. We import a lot, and that's been good for consumers. I think that you can see our three largest imports come from Canada, Mexico, and EU. That's been fairly consistent. We import a whole wide mix of consumer-ready products. We also do a lot of intermediate products that go into production processes, and in the case our NAFTA partners, very integrated market in terms of livestock and other things. And consumers have been big beneficiaries. This just shows a lot of the imports that we do, and this just looks at Mexico fresh fruits and fresh vegetables coming in. You can see how counter-seasonal that is. That is, they're coming in essentially when the U.S. isn't producing much. In the summer months, those exports drop off. This has enabled U.S. consumers to have access to vegetables, fruits and vegetables, pretty much year-round. And if you look at this is a little complicated, but if you look at import penetration and you look at per capita utilization for many of these fruits and vegetables over the last 20 years or so, 25 years, you can see the big gains in fruit and vegetable consumption. And I think that's, again, oftentimes when we talk about these free trade agreements and what could be lost by a trade war or whatever, we tend to focus on producers, but it's, in fact, I would argue that consumers are the ones that are the real losers in this. Well, let me turn a little bit to U.S. agricultural policies. U.S. has provided support to agriculture really all the way back to the founding of the country in the late 18th century through tariffs, other sorts of things. It really, though, most people date most of these programs that we see today still exist in one form or another, dating back to the 1930s with the New Deal legislation. And they've been transformed. They've evolved from command and control type policies, which manage supplies, to much more flexible policies that are based on income, or that are essentially transfer income to producers, but not necessarily based on actual production. And because of that, I think if you look at measures that, say, OECD does, we see that total support has fallen relative to receipts and the percent tied to support. All those both good signs. However, we still give a lot of money to agriculture. This is just the projections by the Congressional Budget Office for current baseline, that is, assuming the current Farm Bill continues for the next 10 years. And you can see, even there, with the major price and income support programs and risk management programs, we're looking at about $12 billion annually. And these programs are tied to prices. A lot of these programs are tied to prices. A lot of these programs are tied to yields. So there's a lot of variation in this. And so if you look at actual outlays, they're all over the map, and they can be actually, the exposure on these things can be quite large. What we report to the WTO under the rules for domestic support, you can see that we've been below our WTO, U.S. has been generally below its WTO bindings, although we had very, very high levels in the late 1990s and early 2000s. However, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't get reported to the WTO, or at least in this calculation of the aggregate measurement of support, and that's due to the fact that it's not included because it's de minimis, it falls below 5% of production. However, if you were to add those back in, you can see that this picture looks very different, that we start to look much more closer to our bindings. Valeria is going to talk about some of this in a minute when we get to the discussion of the upcoming ministerial, but it's just to say that this is a concern. And lastly, I'm going to focus very briefly on dispute settlement, because I think this was one of the hallmark achievements of the Uruguay round, was the establishment of a WTO dispute settlement body. Here, WTO members can challenge other members who they may feel are out of compliance with WTO trading rules. Since the start of this in 1995, over 530 cases have been brought to the WTO dispute settlement body. Not surprising, developed country members have been the largest users of dispute settlement. These cases aren't cheap. You have to put together a pretty big case, but you can see that generally the US and EU have brought a lot. They have counted for over 40% of the cases. I think the EU about 42% and the US about 46%. So they've either participated as a complainant, a respondent, or a third party to the dispute. And as you can see, the U.S. has brought about 115 cases against countries, and but had to respond at about 130. Now, not all these cases obviously involve the agreement on agriculture, because there's a lot of other various agreements that can be a country can be challenged under. But agricultural products actually, even with that, still are involved with a lot of these disputes. Now, just in general, programs can be challenged, as I say, under citing the agreement on agriculture. And good examples of this, the U.S. at the end of last year took a case against China, subsidies on corn, wheat, and rice. Brazil and Canada took a case against the U.S. in 2007 on its domestic subsidies, saying, charging that they were above their AMS bindings, their WTO allowable limits on domestic support. But those two were that was later suspended. And then again, a whole host of other things, agreements. I think what's of key here is the fact that clearly the one case that people point to in terms of agriculture is the Brazil cotton case, where Brazil successfully challenged the U.S. And after several years of negotiations, after the dispute was actually, a decision was made in the courts at the WTO, the U.S. agreed to change the way it ran its programs under the 2014 Farm Bill, and agreed to get rid of price and income support programs for cotton in exchange for an enhanced insurance program. Brazil agreed to this. We're now coming to the end of the 2014 Farm Bill, and the cotton industry now is promoting a change that would actually put more subsidies back into their program and make it more like the other support programs. So stay tuned. I think that could actually result in certainly will catch the interest of the Brazilians in this matter. I think there's a big question in terms of vulnerability, and I would just close with this. That is the subsidies as a percent of production value you see here for just for 2014 and 2015. You can see how this relates across crops. And all this to say is I think that these are things that clearly there's concern about countries or that when you see support levels accounting for a large share of production, those are signs that a country may be able to at least come in here, much like they did with cotton, and start investigating a bit. And so that's something that I think will be a concern and something to certainly watch, and I think something that Congress should really consider. I'm out of time, so I'm not going to really, all is to say that I think this is part of the reason, you'll see it in the book, or the report itself, that this is part of the reason there's still concern, and I think that we would argue, at least Dan and I would argue, that there's still inconsistency between farm policy and trade policy. Great.